Hello, Blake Rudis here with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com, and today we're going to be talking about curves and levels. This question was recently asked via email by one of the readers of Everyday HDR, and I thought it was a very valid question to ask. What is the difference between curves and levels, and am I missing something? Very valid. So, how many of you remember geometry, where you were told that a square, by definition, can be a rectangle, but a rectangle, by definition, could never be a square? It's kind of the same thing with curves and levels, because all of your levels are contained within curves, but your curves are not contained within levels. So curves can kind of be both. Curves can adjust your levels and your curves, and levels can only adjust the levels within the image. And when we're talking about levels, we're talking about the black point, white point, and gray point levels within the photo. So let's look at levels first and see how levels and curves are similar. So what you see here is you have 3 points right here on the levels. Each of them, whether you're in curves or you're in levels, both show you the histogram on the actual adjustment layer. So this point over here on your left is your black point. When you move this, it affects your blacks. When you move this, it affects your whites. And then in between, you have your midtones, or what's also referred to as your gamma slider, because that's actually adjusting the overall gamma within your photo, but what it's actually doing is affecting your midtones. So with that being said, we have to adjust a white and black clipping point here. So within this photograph, we can tell that there isn't a whole lot of black. So how we can do that is if we actually click Alt Option on that black panel, we can move that to the right, and that starts to show us where we actually start to see versions of black showing up in our photo. So that will help us add some contrast. Similarly, over here in level or in curves, we can do the exact same thing. If we press Alt Option on that black paddle, we move it to the right, it's the exact same thing. If our inputs are the same, if our input over here is 37, or let's say 33, and then our input over here is 33, we can just type it in manually, we have the exact same photograph, because we're adjusting the levels within the curves. We're adjusting the level points of our tone in the curve itself. So on the right hand side, we have our highlights, or our whites. If we press Alt or Option, it'll turn all black, and then as we move it to the left, it'll start to show us areas that are actually coming through as pure white within the channels that they're coming through. So you see it's happening pretty much within the blue channel there. Same thing with curves. Press Alt or Option, move it to the left, you can see that we start to introduce the exact same thing. So at this point, we have the exact same photograph because the levels have been adjusted accordingly. In the middle here, we have the gray or mid-tone adjustment. So if we move this to the right, our overall image is going to get darker. If we move it to the left, our overall image is going to get lighter in the mid-tones of our image. Now the difference in curves is that we don't actually have that. How you control those mid-tones is by adjusting the actual curve. That's going to be our mids, because curves are kind of three-dimensional. I mean, if we look at levels, all we have are left, right, and that's it. We can either move our shadows to the right or to the left, and that's it. Highlights to the right, highlights to the left, that's it. But in curves, we actually get the ability to apply points. So it's three-dimensional in that you can adjust it almost 360 around this curve idea. So if you look right here, this quadrant is going to be your darks, with the darkest portions being down here in the photograph, and as it transitions into your midtones, with this quadrant being right here in the photograph, and then this quadrant up here is going to be your highlights. So what it allows you to do is independently modify the highlights from the shadows. So if we wanted to protect our highlights, or maybe make our highlights have a little bit more dark depth to them, we could drop the depth and give our highlights a little bit more depth there. That is something that we cannot do here in levels. All we can do is move it to the left or to the right, and that's it. Here we can actually modify the amount of tone that's in our highlights by going into the curve section for those highlights. So curves and levels both have their own individual strengths. The thing about levels is that this is what you see is what you get here. With curves, you can get really dynamic into the amount of range that you can pull out within your photograph. Same thing with the shadows here. Now we can independently modify the shadows and make our shadows deeper by bringing that down within the curve. This is something that we could not do here in levels, but we can within curves. The other thing that we have here in our levels and curves is what you can see right here. We'll just go ahead and reset these. What you can see here is we actually have white, black, and gray point adjustments. So what I can do is I can zoom in to a point in my photograph that I want to be black. So let's say I zoom in right here to this portion right here. I say I want that point to be black. And then if I zoom out and I say, okay, I want this point up here to be considered white. Same thing in your curves or in your levels. You can zoom into that point. You can select your black point here. You can zoom out and you can zoom in and you can find your white point up here to give you an overall reference point of your white and your black point. Now that's not actually affecting the tone. If you can see here, it's actually affecting our RGB channels or our red, green, and blue channels. So it's modifying our red, green, and blue channels to allow us to get those areas that we selected the closest to black and white as possible. Another thing that curves has that levels does not is you see this little finger here. That's the targeted adjustment tool. What you can do within the curves is you can click the target adjustment tool and you can actually go into an area. Let's say this area. We want this area right here to be darker. So we can just click right here and drag it down. And notice how it's dragging our curve down and making that area darker. We can go to another area and say this area right here. Let's say we want to make this a little bit lighter. That will lighten up that area, make that highlight a little bit lighter. Now, when we're doing this, when you're looking at this photograph, this is adjusting the overall color in our photograph. So what you can actually do is change the blending option here to luminosity. So now when you look at the before and after, it's only affecting the luminance value of the curve, not the color. Okay, so that's something that's very important to remember, is that if you start to see your colors getting really contrasty here, just change that to luminosity so it's only affecting the tone if tone is what you're dealing with. How that differs from levels, levels does not have a targeted adjustment tool. So you can't target this specific area and make it lighter or darker. So each one has their own power in a sense. Down here you see on the levels adjustment, you have a gradient bar. This is basically saying, okay, black, you're over here. The further I move you to the right, we're going to say that that's as black is now a version of gray. So you can see all of the black in our image has now turned to a certain shade of gray. If we go right to the middle with this, let's say to 128, and then we do the same thing on this side and move this down to 128, we get a 50% gray image. Now with curves, let's go ahead and reset this. If we move our curve adjustment up here on the gradient bar, right up to the middle, and then we do the same thing on the opposite side, we now have a 50% gray photo. So curves actually contains all of the abilities to modify a photo that levels does. They just do it on a different wavelength, if you want to call it that. Each one has their own place in your workflow. You can set the levels first and then go ahead and modify your curves, or you can set the levels within your curves and modify your curves accordingly. But you're not restricted to just one curves and one level, so always keep that in mind. You can also add multiple curves and multiple levels adjustments. That's where it gets kind of interesting, because all you have to do is just go down here and create a levels. Now you have a levels on a curves layer. I just like to see these side by side so we can see things differently. So we talked about tone. Let's now talk about color. So if we look at the levels adjustment, you can see that in the levels adjustment right here you have something that says RGB. So what you're affecting is the overall RGB, all channels, red, green, and blue, all combined. So what that is, that's your luminance. You're actually affecting the luminance within the overall photo by going into RGB. Now you can actually go into red, green, and blue individually. So if we move the black point over, our whole image starts to get more green. If we move the white point over, our whole image starts to get more red. And if we do that in the midtones, we can either make our image more red or more of a cyan color. It's actually cyan, not green, because red and cyan are opposite on the color wheel, the digital color wheel. Down here with the gradient bar, same thing. You're just telling all of that area to become red. And then over here, same thing. You're just telling all of your whites to become a little bit more cyan. So you can really do some pretty interesting color grading with levels. I actually like to do my color grading with levels and curves combined. So let's go ahead and look at the green adjustment. If we move this to the right, our overall photo is going to get more magenta until it's pretty much all magenta. And then if we move it to the left, our overall photo is going to get all green until it's pretty much all green. Same thing down here. So you can go in here and you can add some pretty nice color quality to a photograph, or color temperature to a photograph. This is where you start to get more intricate color temperature adjustments. So instead of just moving the temperature slider over to the left or to the right in Adobe Camera Raw, you can come into Photoshop and you can go into the curves and levels and really get in there to your highlights and your shadows. Not quite as much as you can in curves, so let's go ahead and look at that in curves. But you can get a nice color temperature. So let's go into blue real quick before we go into curves. If we move this right, our image is going to get more yellow. Move it to the left, our image is going to get more blue. And then we can control those midtones accordingly in between. So you can get some nice tonal quality to the yellow in this photo. And then this is where you can also do some interesting cross-processing, because then I could go over here to the reds and I can modify the reds in a really interesting way to get an effect that you wouldn't normally get straight out of camera, that you get a nice vintage looking effect with your levels. So curves has the exact same ability. Within curves, you have the RGB channel up here. If you go down, you have the red, green, and blue. So let's go into red. The difference between curves and levels here is that, just like we said before, if we move this to the right, our overall image is going to get more cyan. If we move this to the left, our overall image is going to get more red. All right. Now the same thing applies, but we can go into the individual highlights, midtones, and shadows of the color red. This is the beauty. If we bring up this point right here, our overall image gets more red in our midtones. If we bring it down, it gets more cyan in our midtones. But let's say we just want to make our midtones a little bit more cyan, but not affect our shadows and not affect our highlights. We can do that as well. Now that's a little extreme, but now our midtones are getting a little bit more green and our midtones are getting a little bit more red, but it's overall protecting, look at that, our highlights and our shadows. So that's very powerful. We can do the same thing with green. Let's say we want to make the darks a little greener, but not affect the midtones and the highlights. And then we can go into blue. Let's say if we move it up in the curve, we actually get more blue. Move it down, we actually get more yellow. So let's make this a little bit more yellow in the midtones, but not do that in the shadows. Let's make the shadows more blue and our highlights be a little bit protected. So you can see you can get some pretty interesting cross-processing effects with those individual adjustments. Now those were pretty extreme. You can also do some very minor color temperature adjustments within these as well by using the RGB channels independently from the actual overall RGB luminance of that image. Now one thing you don't want to forget here is that you can always change your blend modes to something like color so that the overall color gets applied to the image, or luminosity so that it only affects the luminance values. You can change this to something like soft light so you can get some really dynamic photo there. Overlay, same thing. So you can always change the blending options and the opacity. So let's say the blending option of soft light looks pretty good, but the opacity needs to be dropped down a little bit. You can always adjust your opacity and your blending options. That's one thing you always need to remember when you're working with adjustment layers. So overall, the difference is curves can be levels, curves contain levels. Levels cannot be curves. Both of them can adjust tone and color accordingly. But curves, you have a little bit more power with curves than you do with levels. So we discussed that on tone to get the overall tone in your image better. Remember, pressing Alt or Option on either one of those paddles on the left-hand side will allow you to see where your image starts to clip. And it's a good idea to clip in some of those shadows, especially like we could do it right here with this image. We could Alt-click on the shadows and move this in to make our overall shadows a little bit darker, and do the same thing over here to make our highlights a little bit more brighter. But we have a lot of highlight blowout right now anyway. So just remember, you can do some pretty creative things with curves and levels, on top of getting all of the tone and color spot on for the photo that you're working with. I certainly hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I really do hope that it clears up some of that difference between curves and levels for you. And everyone uses these curves and levels adjustments differently. So from what you've seen me doing, you might see somebody else do something differently. I use both to get my overall tone and color correct in my photo, and I also use them, like you see here, to make some more creative effects. So if you like this tutorial, please like it, comment, share it, tell your friends, because there's somebody else that might need this tutorial as well. Again, my name is Blake Rudis with EverydayHDR.com and HDRinsider.com. Thank you.